want to be very careful about making that assumption. And that leads us to looking for some of the signs of people who are going through chronic stress. So some of the signs, do you remember what the signs were?
Children eat a lot. Some people eat a lot, some don't eat.
Okay, so it could lead to an eating disorder, but not always. What about, do you remember what was motivation, right? And oftentimes it can be a lack of motivation, a withdrawal from the community. Remember that one? Okay, like excessive irritation. Or I'll just say easily irritated. Does anyone remember anything else?
Sleeping disorders, maybe.
Sometimes, yeah. So maybe overly tired due to sleeping disorders.
Or violent behavior.
Ooh. I'm like writing love. I don't know where that came from. That's because I keep wanting to start with an L. And what was the last one that was really good?
Violent behavior.
Violent behavior.
Maybe rudeness. When the person became rude.
Yeah, sure. That's a good one. Being rude, or even sometimes it comes out in bullying. Right, because sometimes the children mimic what they see at home. And if the parents are bullying each other, or one parent is bullying the other parent, that comes out in their behavior because they understand that to be how you relate to people, right? So these are some good examples about what we talked about last time. That's great. I'm glad that you all remember. So let's talk about now. Again, not all students will have these responses. It doesn't mean that just because they see it at home, they will react in a rude way or a bullying way, etc., etc. It's just these are some possibilities that when we see students who are having these problems, instead of making snap judgments, we want to get more information about that student. So we want to try to connect with the student in some way. And yesterday, one of our participants brought out a great way to connect with students when we're trying to get more information about these types of characteristics, and that is to use third-party stories. So it's a story about somebody else who's going through a difficult time, but the students can maybe relate to it, right? So it's a story about Doug, who just lost his father in a car accident, and how he is dealing with the loss of his father. And so then maybe the students can relate to that, and you can get further information. They feel like they're not talking about themselves, so they're more free to talk about their actual feelings as one possibility. Okay, so moving on to resilience. So we learned that resilience is one of the ways that we can overcome, or not overcome, that's the wrong word. I think work through chronic stress and anxiety and or feelings related to trauma. So we're going to learn a little bit more about resilience today. That's under the self-care portion. But what do you remember the psychologist that we watched last time saying about resilience? What was one form of resilience that you recall? Physical exercise, right? So engaging in physical exercise as a way to release some of the emotions that are pent up. Okay, what was another way?
Understand what gives you meaning.
Yeah, understand what gives you meaning. And hold on 1 second to that thought. So when we're talking about this is easier for us as adults, right? So if we're working with even high school, it will not be so difficult to talk about how do you understand meaning. But when you're working with young learners, we have to think of, other ways that we can get them to understand meaning without saying to them, now, I want you to understand what brings meaning to your life, right? Because they'll be like, what are you talking about? So does anyone have some suggestions for when you're working with younger learners? How can we help them to understand their own meaning?
Gestures.
Gestures, okay.
Pictures.
Teachers, teach about it.
Pictures.
Pictures.
Yeah.
So can you tell me an example of how that would look? Like, what are you thinking?
Draw a picture, for example, of something.
Okay, so we would need to ask them a question though, right? Like, what do you really, really like? Or like, what's your favorite thing to do in this world? Draw a picture. Yes, good. So we're asking them to think about what they feel passionate about, what they really, really like, because what they like is something that would give them meaning, right? But they don't know that it's giving them meaning. They just know, I like this. This makes me feel happy, right? Okay, good. And what were you going to add?
No, I would like to say for the small children, very important, for all children, especially for small, very important to be accepted. Accepted and feel their love, because for primary school teacher it's like another mother, and they all
Very
try
true.
to hug teacher, something like this. And another meaning for small children, it's the main activities is playing, to ability to play.
Right.
Play is like way to learning life.
Okay, so what we could say, what do you like to do, and maybe what is your favorite game? Like playing house or this or that for them. Yeah, what did you want to add?
Who is the person you love most?
Oh yeah, nice.
Do you have some friend, some close friend?
On the mail. But one of the definitions that he wrote about in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, is the connection that we have with other people, giving us meaning. So sometimes it's things that we do, sometimes it's connections with other people, and sometimes it's how we behave in certain situations. So these would be good questions to ask younger learners to help them to kind of understand themselves. And there was a third one. Does anyone remember the third one? Physical exercise, meaning. No, not in your notes?
Meditation.
No, that will come today.
Maybe it's the goal.
Attitude, yeah, attitude is important. What
Maybe
else?
it's the goal in your life. Something you have to do.
Having a goal, attitude. Okay, that's not exactly what he said, and I was using you to help me remember, so we will have to pass on that one. But for sure, it is covered in this presentation. I went through everything in this presentation. But for resilience, and resilience is another way to look at our coping mechanisms, right? How we can get through a traumatic situation and our constant stress. These are good to start with, and we'll look at the rest later. So, for trauma-sensitive classrooms, the first thing that we want to look at is having an empathetic approach. So one of the things that I want to go to before we look at collaboratively working to ensure students feel safe, trusted, and welcome. This is in our classroom by itself, like us as the teacher, but also in the school. The first thing though I want to look at is what's the difference between empathetic and sympathetic, because they're very similar ideas or terms, but they are very different. And so the first thing that I want to look at is sympathy. Sympathy is the feeling that you care about and are sorry about someone else's trouble, grief, misfortune, etc. So this is outside. So it's like, oh, I understand you're going through this difficult time. I'm so sorry that this is happening to you. But it's outside. You're not really connecting with that person. Versus empathy, the feeling that you understand and share another person's experiences and emotions. The ability to share someone else's feelings. So this is about connection. This is about, I understand what you're going through. Maybe I also experienced something similar, or my friend did, or my mother did, etc., etc. So you're connecting with them, not saying like, oh, I'm so sorry you're going through that. So I'd like us to watch Dr. Brene Brown. She has a nice clip on YouTube that talks a little bit more and goes a little deeper into the difference between empathy and sympathy. And for us as teachers, we want to focus on empathy, not sympathy, right? Because the whole point, one of the issues that students who are in chronic stress feel is isolation. And so isolation, you want to go with connection, right? Not disconnection. So let's look at what she has to say. While we're watching this, I'd like you to think about how it is relevant to your, sorry, I have to find it. Okay. How is empathy relevant to your role as a teacher? Like, where do you see your role as a teacher in terms of the empathetic approach? All right, let's see that connection in the classroom. Why is it important to be empathetic teachers and not sympathetic teachers? What do you think?
Because I think that children will not accept our sympathy. It's even worse than pretending that you don't know about their troubles or traumas or something.
Okay. For sure. I definitely agree with that. How many of you have had that moment where someone did the at least thing that the deer or whatever did? How did you feel in that moment? When someone said, you said, oh, this is happening, and they're like, well, at least X, Y, and Z, you probably didn't feel like happy about the communication, right? You were kind of like, well, that's the last time I'm telling them something. The last thing I want to hear is at least, and then there's a silver lining, right? And so I agree with you that I think not only children, but also adults, when you create that kind of environment, they just shut down, or they're not likely to continue to try to communicate with you, right? You know the friends that you call because they're empathetic, and you know the friends that you call or you don't call because they're sympathetic. And so in the classroom, what we're trying to do is we're trying to create this environment that feels safe for the children. And oftentimes what they need is to feel the connection, right? Because one of you said earlier that you're like the second parent. And even when you're working with university or adults, you're not obviously the second parent, but people tend to respond better to you if you have more of an empathetic approach. And so that's why we want to focus on empathy when we're working with students who are struggling with trauma or chronic stress. Okay, so an empathetic approach also reminds us that children have had or have currently little control over their lives. And so when they do things, we want to remind ourselves that oftentimes we react and our reaction is based on the idea that they understand what they did. And they understand why what they did was not acceptable. And it could be that they should understand. But we also have to look at what happened and why they might have reacted in that way. So for example, last week we talked about asking students who who have had a traumatic incident or feel chronic stress, possibly to do a role play. Everybody else in the class is doing a role play, and we ask them to do a role play and they say no. And instead of thinking like, well, why did they say no, we think, well, everybody else is doing a role play, why are you being so difficult? You know, and then they become difficult rather than maybe the role play is terrifying for them at that moment because they don't feel comfortable, they don't feel safe. And so just thinking about what occurred whenever there was a moment when somebody acted out, why they acted out, so getting to know them and what would make them comfortable, and understanding what you or I as an educator need to do to bridge the trauma, to make them feel safe. So if I understand that I have some students in the classroom who don't feel safe, I have to think about how can I teach in a way that allows them to build into doing a role play. Instead of just saying, okay, first time role play, go, you know, we would have to structure it in and give them enough structure so that they would feel eventually comfortable standing up in front of the entire class doing a role play. And these are not just students with trauma, right? Many students also have anxiety concerning their ability to speak English and to go in front of the entire class and do a role play. Okay, so the role of empathetic educators requires that we don't punish students for behaviors they cannot control, including defiance. This is very difficult because as educators, we've been taught to punish students who are defiant, right? So this is almost going counterculture to what we learned. So one of the things, one of the reasons for this, when I was reading through the literature, is that when you're treating the students in this way, you're creating more of a gap between you and the student and less of a bridge, right? If you're punishing them and maybe you're sending them out of the room or you're making them do this or you're making them do that, it's a disconnection. And so instead, we want to focus on more positive behavioral classroom management techniques. So I have on YouTube one of the workshops that I've done previously on positive behavioral management techniques. And I encourage you to look at that for more information on what that looks like and what that is like. Use a sensitive, positive, and responsive approach. So making sure also that we know who our students are. That's the key. You know, we may not know immediately that they have trauma, but if we know we're finding out as much information as possible about them, then we know, we have an idea of who is going to respond, what way to which activities, how we need to lead them into the activities so that they can successfully complete them. And then they also say, avoid overcare and too much sympathy. Again, because as we saw in the video, sympathy creates a disconnect between you and the students that you're trying to work with and to help. Okay. So one of the things that we can do is behavioral plans, and this is for all students. This is not just, one student, because that would also create a rift, right? If you're like, oh, you're the one student I think that needs a behavioral plan. Here, let's work together on your behavioral plan. And the student's like, why didn't you give it to anybody else? Obviously, you have a concern about me, and how's that going to make them feel, right? So they should be for all, and basically what it does is it maps out what appropriate behaviors are, and then students can work on practicing these appropriate behaviors. So you make it very clear about, when is listening time, when is speaking time, all of that kind. So you can see that a behavioral plan is not for secondary school or for university, right? They would be like, what is this? It works much better with much younger learners, also because the younger learners haven't quite mastered their ability to control their emotions, their reactions, things like that yet. Okay, and it also helps students to see that there are aspects that they can control in their lives. They can control their anger, even though they don't think they can. They can control a lot of things. They have to be taught strategies, but they can use the coping mechanisms. And like I said, they may not yet have inner control if they're young. Okay. Strategies. So how we can make sure that in our classroom we're creating this safe environment is by giving explicit instruction. So this is very important so that the students know exactly what you are expecting from them and their behavior, whether it be a group or a pair or individually what they should be doing. And when we do this, obviously, as you all know, we're also trying to do it in several ways. So we do it orally. We also maybe have written things down on the board, so if they don't remember, they can look up and they know what's expected and they feel a sense of support. Consistent, positively oriented instruction. So this is also an example from the positive classroom management. But when you see students writing, taking notes, and you say, very good X, Y, and Z, A, B, and C, I see that you're taking notes. That shows me that you're listening to me. Instead of going to all those who are not taking notes, why aren't you taking notes? How do I know you're paying attention if you're not taking notes? Repeat what I just said, right? So there's a very different interaction between that. Number 3, an environment where students can contribute actively. So when they have more of a chance to engage and to share with each other, they feel better because they feel like they have more ownership over the activities. They're more interested in the activities. There's less teacher talk. And so that's better. Number 4, intentional thinking skills instruction. So basically what this looks like is that whenever you're asking them to do something, you act it out or you model it. So this could be, if we're again going back to the idea of the role play, we do a sample role play together and then the students do the role play so they know the sample shows them what's expected. Or I might say for young learners, when I'm clapping, that means all eyes on me, shut your mouth. Not shut your mouth, be quiet. Okay, but that when you do it several times and you get them like through repetitive instruction, you're actually training them where they may not have been trained before. Because one of the things we talked about last week in the last presentation is we had students who have gone through trauma. You remember we had circles on the behavior, right? And so we had the child, and then if they are disrupted, this is what that becomes. But normally from the child we have the family, and then we have the community. And then we have, let's say school and peers. And then from school and peers, we have the outer community, or we can say community at large. So the child, they form relationships, first with family members, then they move on to the community, and then they move on to school, peers, community at large, and this is the structure of how they're forming relationships. When that's disrupted, they don't have the same capabilities as others who have gone through this process. And so this has a possibility to impact their social learning structures in the classroom as well. So it's just something we need to think about. And this is why this is very important, because one of the things that we teach in family is how to pay attention when an adult is speaking, right? Or when other people are speaking. We teach children that explicitly, the parents or the grandparents. There are certain lessons that set them up to thrive academically. You know, we ask them questions. A child might say, why is the sky blue? Well, what do you think? Right? And so it's teaching critical thinking. But if that's not there, the children are not getting the same input that the other children had, and it's harder for them to interact in school because they just don't have the background to do so. Questions so far? No? Is everyone okay? All right. So, how can we help students know the routines and practices we will be using? This is one of the questions we have to ask ourselves, right? So whenever we have a new group of students, or whenever we're working with students ourselves, this is the first thing we should be asking ourselves. How can we help them to know the routines we'll be using? Even in university, the first time you give an activity, they don't know what to expect, right? And so how can we guide them into that? I had to do this at university. I had, for some students, we had an online portion of the course, and they didn't know how to use it. So I had to think, how can I create, how can I understand what they don't know that they don't know, and create activities so that I can make sure by the time they get to the computer and they need to know what they need to know to complete the online portion, all the knowledge is there, right? So this is one of our jobs as a teacher, questioning. The other question that we want to think about when we're trying to create this empathetic classroom is, what's happening and how do I use an empathetic approach, right? So what was the event? What is occurring right now? Thinking probably we might turn to anger, or we might be frustrated with whatever event is happening, but we might then, in the middle of it, try to do our deep breath 3 times. As we teach the children, when you feel angry, breathe 3 times before you have an emotion as part of the behavioral plan, right? Or before you say something. And then thinking at the same time, okay, so what would the empathetic approach be like to address this event, whatever it might be? So those are the things that we want to be constantly thinking of as teachers. So the first one we've talked about, supporting them whenever they have new approaches. This is very much like scaffolding, but not just scaffolding activities, scaffolding understanding of activities, right? Because scaffolding is oftentimes the content of the activity and having them being able to do the content of the activity, whereas we're also scaffolding how to do the activity as well as the content. Okay, so continue to support them until they are able to do the activities on their own, and then avoid compassion fatigue. And we will talk about that in a little bit. And I will give you more information about what compassion fatigue means. But it's something that I'm sure at some point we have all felt with some of the students that we work with in all grades, from the littlest ones to the biggest ones. Okay, I should say the oldest ones. So trauma-sensitive schools. Basically, all must be involved. That's what the research is saying. We want to have school counselors involved. They can be the first line of defense, if you will. Do all of who here works at school, by the way? Anybody? Most of you, university? Yeah? So if you work at school, oftentimes schools have counselors, and the counselors are trained in psychology and or social work, and so they have a background and can help to train staff and talk to parents about the needs of the students and or the needs of or how to create an empathetic approach, right? School teachers, us being like in school or in university, what we can do is we can continue to take personal training time and develop our understanding of what this looks like in the classroom and how we can integrate it even sometimes into our course material, so that in addition to teaching maybe language strategies, we're teaching life strategies. In a way, it's the whole person development that we've talked about before. Everybody has to be involved when you're looking at the school itself. Let's ignore this question for now. So a whole school effort would look something like this. A shared understanding of everyone. So this includes the cooks, the people who are cleaning. It includes the counselors, the teachers. Everybody that is in the school should have training in creating a safe environment for the students. Second, the school supports all students to feel safe physically, socially, emotionally, and academically. So working on ways to make sure that they feel a connection is very important. Having maybe some after-school activities or some other activities for the students so that they can feel like they have an outlet, a place that they can go to, developing the feeling of safety. Number 3, school addresses needs in holistic ways, taking into account their relationships. So this is teacher-student, student-student relationships, right? Self-regulation. So especially for younger learners, their ability to control themselves and to make comments in class that maybe are appropriate and or behaviors that are appropriate. Universities sometimes, there are students who don't have self-regulation as well, where they just say the first thing that comes to their mind, whether or not it's offensive to the other students, and therefore they create a distance. People don't really like them as much. So working with them on that, academic confidence, and emotional and physical well-being. So this, again, these are very difficult because sometimes the students have real threats in their lives, and sometimes they have perceived threats in their lives. For the students, it doesn't matter if it's a real threat or a perceived threat. They will react about the threat in the same way, right? Okay. So number 4 is that school explicitly connects students to the school community and provides multiple opportunities to practice newly developed skills. The 5th one is that they are embracing teamwork, and everybody is involved in teamwork and in the shared responsibility for all students. So what that might look like is that the school is continuing to have trainings and talking about, so our goal for the school is to create this safe environment. We have already done A, B, C, but we need to keep working. How can we together join all of our skills as a group to keep working on creating this sense of safety for our students, right? So that's using teamwork towards the goal of creating this safe environment. Leadership and staff continually adapt to the ever-changing needs of the learners it's important to be open also to what those needs are, right? You cannot adapt if you are not listening. So being open to feedback, getting feedback, understanding the feedback, and taking the time to adapt. So right now what I want to do is I want to go a little more in detail about number 5. Environment that community created.
Maybe it's about collaboration between as it was mentioned, medical staff, psychologists, even cleaners, whoever, the principal. So the whole faculty, all the people who work in school, and their collaborative fact should create a kind of atmosphere in which such students will be understood and supported, something like that.
Sure. I think one of the keys for me in this particular TED Talk was, she said the first thing they did was got together and talked about what skills they all had, and how those skills could best be put towards working with the woman to recover herself, right? So very much, as you said, in terms of schools, what skills does everyone have that can be put towards making sure that the students have a safe and comfortable environment? Everybody is talented, everybody has skills. Many of us aren't using all of our skills in the school environment.
I would like to add, maybe not deeply connected with this topic. I had experience when we work at camp. We have this teamwork, and no, it's not school children with trauma, just ordinary school children, but we had less work and more time for our rest, because each group of children knows that not only the teacher can say something, but all team. That's why discipline was very good, and we have enough good time for rest
Great
after they go
example.
to bed. Yes.
Great example, great example. Okay, so again, this information came from traumasensitive-schools.org. This was the information I mentioned earlier. That was the Massachusetts Advocates for Children and Harvard Law School. This is their website for working with kids or children who have been in trauma. Okay, so we move on to, I think now, the third section with the very little time that we have left. And we are looking at our trauma-sensitive selves, and we revisit the term compassion fatigue to define it. Compassion fatigue is basically when we take on other people's problems as our own. And so you see it a lot with aid workers who are working in very difficult circumstances, where they begin to feel the same upset that their students or the other people that they're working with feel because they are connecting emotionally with them, right? The teachers, we do this as well. We may not know that it is called compassion fatigue, but I'm sure that most of us have experienced this at some point in time with a student who has come to us for help about something that was not necessarily related to school, but about personal things. So one of the things that we have to think about when we think about compassion fatigue is pretty much it will happen. So how do we deal with our own feelings, or how do we deal with our own trauma? Because as I mentioned earlier, in terms of trauma, we have it as well, right? It's not just other people. So something could happen in our lives where we lose someone suddenly, or a violent incident occurs and we are not recovering from it as much as or as quickly as we would like. So how do we overcome that? So we can look first at Viktor Frankl's principles, and putting them in practice, they would look something like this. So he was the one who I mentioned, the book Man's Search for Meaning. The first one, exercise our personal freedom to choose our outlook or attitude. So part of this is based on the ability to reflect on our thoughts and on our emotions. So taking a step back and adding some perspective, or looking at ourselves from a distance and realize that while we may feel anger right now, as the more we reflect on it and the more that we take a step back and look at it, maybe from a different perspective, the more we're able to work through the anger, right? And so we can then choose how we would like to talk about or how we would like to feel about that experience. This also works with fear. The story that I told yesterday to one of the participants was when I was working in Afghanistan, in Kabul, we had an attack that occurred on Parliament while I was there. I was in the middle of class. I was just about to give the homework, and someone came into the room and was like, you need to go right now. And to make a long story short, I left and we went to the safe area. And we figured out that the fighting was happening on the other side of town, and it may be okay for us to take a car to our house. And so the woman that lived across the hall from me, we were like, we need to go. Because if we wait, it could get worse. And if it gets worse, that means we're staying at the university indefinitely. So we took a risk and we went. They had shut off the road because there was fighting on the road to the apartment, the normal one that we took. So our driver worked miracles and was able to find another road for us to use. I get to the apartment and I can hear like gunshots in the background. I can hear like RPFs going. These are the rockets, rocket propelled grenades and stuff like that. I should say RPGs. And I'm looking at the walls of my house and they're all glass. And I'm thinking, I'm really scared because I'm like, if something lands nearby, all the glass will come inside and I will have no chance, right? And so I'm like, oh my gosh, what do I do? So of course I call my best friend and I'm like, Nihar, what do I do? Like, my place is all full of glass, and when I'm on the phone with him, I can hear like these grenades going off very close to him because he's in their bunker underground, because he was at the British Embassy and they were actually being attacked. And so he's like, so tell me about the layout of your house, tell me about this, tell me about that. And he was like, okay, so what I want you to do is get in the bathtub and stay in the bathtub until all of the action stops. And then it was silent. And I was like, Nihar, and he was not there. And I got really scared because I was like, I really hope that was not my last conversation, right? He's like, get in the bathtub. Boom. And so, to make a long story short, like, I'm trying really not to traumatize you, but I'm telling it, I hope, with humor. Because it was a very traumatic moment in my life, but when I look back now, thinking about all of the things that happened, like get in the bathtub for 12 hours, it's funny. But you have to be able to choose the attitude and to reflect on the experience from distance in order to get to the point where you can tell the story with hopefully more humor than when it was actually happening, right? And maybe I'm not such a good storyteller because none of you laughed, but that was the idea behind the story, okay? So also we have don't work against ourselves, and basically what this is referring to is we all have self-talk. This self-talk occurs inside, right? And it's the self-talk that compares ourselves with our friends, our family, other people. So basically that self-talk is not helpful most of the time, right? When we're comparing, we're judging, and judgment doesn't help us. So not to do that when we're in a situation. Like, make sure that we are trying to not think like, well, how come he went through this situation and he's fine and I'm not? Just be with what happened, how you feel about it, and work through the emotions, right? Don't try to numb the emotions or hide from the emotions. Okay. Define and redefine. Sometimes meaning changes. Sometimes. Sometimes it stays the same. But constantly looking at yourself, what you're going through, and what you're surrounded with in life to make sure, are you having meaningful and significant encounters or not? Is your job meaningful? If not, how can you make it meaningful? How can you search for areas that will add more meaning to your work? Right? Because we can't always change our work. Sometimes we have to change the way that we look at our work. Reflect on life and draw conclusions, and extend beyond yourself is basically try to help others. You know, whether it be volunteering or even something simple like, you know, helping an older person cross the street when they look like they can't make it, or they look like they're really traumatized, if you will, about crossing the street. So, teaching self-care, this information that I'm about to give you comes from the Headington Institute, which is what I mentioned earlier. It's a group of psychologists that work specifically for aid workers, but all of this is relevant to ourselves as well, because this is the same in the literature I've looked at for teacher self-care. Similar to what we talked about earlier, right? Making sure we have regular exercises, attempting to sleep, healthy eating, because what we eat really does impact our mood and our mind, drinking enough water, making sure that we have some laughter, limit alcohol to intake because it's a depressant. Doesn't matter how happy you are, if you're drinking, it's still a depressant. Relaxation techniques, and we'll talk a little bit about some of those in a minute. Interesting for me was the massage, whirlpool, and sauna. I was like, what? When I read further, I understood that with massage, you're connecting. Someone is actually physically touching you and connecting with you, and that can actually help. For whirlpool and sauna, because it's warm and you're stimulating the body and you're stimulating circulation, etc., that can also help you. Repetitive activities, so things that you do over and over and over again, can actually help you come to terms with thinking and what's going on for yourself. How are we doing? Okay, we have just 1 minute. So impact. Alternate nostril nose breathing is something that we learn in yoga, and it has actually been shown through research, although I can't name the exact research. They have shown that when you do this, you're basically opening up your breath. When you feel stress or anxiety, you stop breathing deeply. This is normal, this happens. Whenever you're angry, you're not breathing deeply. So what this does is it forces you to breathe deeply. And basically what you're doing is you're taking your thumb, you're putting it on the right nostril. You can take this finger and put it here if you want to, you don't have to. And then you're using your middle finger to close the left nostril. And so what you do is you open one side, you breathe in for 4, you hold, and then you exhale out the other side for, say, 4. Then you breathe in this side for 4, you hold, and then you exhale out the other side. And you continue to do this process until you feel a sense of calm. Like, you probably don't want to do it 80 times in a row, that's not healthy either, but about 8 times is enough to get enough breath and breathing. This also, by the way, if you have a cold and you feel stuffed up here, it helps to clear that. Okay, so teaching self-care in terms of emotional and relational, making sure that we have nurturing relationships We are surrounding ourselves with people who are empathetic and not sympathetic. We have contact regularly with home, friends by email or Facebook, depending on our situation. We're talking. We use humor to deal with things and to connect with people. Ongoing support group. So a support group could be something like a book club. It's just an opportunity for people going through similar experiences to talk about what they're going through, to get other opinions and ideas about how to cope with the same experiences. Reflection, so journaling, writing, meditation, poetry, writing music, creative activities, painting, drawing, playing music, etc. Counseling with well-trained and appropriate counselors, right? You want to make sure that they are actual counselors, because they could actually do harm if they're not. And storytelling. So again, this information comes from the Headington Institute. You can also find more details about it online at the Headington Institute. This is Understanding and Coping with Traumatic Stress. This is a module, a specific module this all comes from. I wanted to do an activity, well, first I was going to show you the nefarious 15 list, but we don't have time for that today. We are completely out of time. But if you go to Oprah.com and you look for Dr. Phil's nefarious 15, it talks about traits that people have that are not helpful. So when we look at nurturing relationships, the nefarious 15 lists are not traits that occur in nurturing relationships. They are traits that occur in relationships that you might want to consider keeping. Okay? And he goes very quickly, so you may want to do some further research on that. Finally, teaching self-care, they also included spiritual in this. And for them, spiritual doesn't necessarily mean a higher power, but basically it could be where you find meaning in your life, participating in a community of meaning and purpose, so people who share similar meaning and purpose, regular times of prayer, meditation, or reading, depending on what it is that makes you feel better, meaningful conversations, singing or listening to spiritual music, contact with religious leaders or other inspiring individuals. Whatever, again, it's about meaning. It's about being able to draw from others for inspiration, right? And for life lessons. And then time with art, nature. We all love nature, right? Music. And solitude. Not surrounding ourselves by other people all the time. Solitude is very important because it helps us to understand what we are going through. It helps us to go through the emotions, yeah? We don't always like anger. We don't always like sadness. But we have to go through it. We have to feel it and then let it go, right? Okay, so we're not going to do that. Meditation, I just want to show you this. Oh, actually, I don't need to show you this. At www.chopra.com, this is Deepak Chopra, and he has online a series of meditations that you can do occasionally for free. They're 21-day-long meditations, and they deal with different aspects of your life. And I oftentimes use them to fall asleep because I have a hard time sleeping. And they're wonderful for that, but they're also wonderful if you don't need to use them to fall asleep. So basically, he will start with an explanation of the meditation, of a mantra that he gives you, and what it means. And then you sit for a period between 5 and 10 minutes, and you're just meditating. And then the meditation is over. And so, again, they'll have it for 21-day segments. And they have a free one on the site right now, so you can experience what it's like. These are the references. Understanding and Coping with Trauma and Stress by Lisa McKay at the Headington Institute. This was the information where we had the self-care and all the emotions of self-care. Viktor Frankl's Principle for Discovering Meaning in Life and Work. This was Alex Patakos. he wrote this book, Prisoners of Our Thoughts, and then that was the rest, and so you can find that online. Trauma-sensitive schools, you already wrote this one down. Dr. Zacharian and Miss Haynes for teaching English learners living with trauma, violence, and stress in Texas in 2013, and then again in 2014. And that's everything. We went a little over time, sorry about that. Questions, comments, or concerns? If not, thank you for coming.
Thank you.